Well, good evening. It is 6 o'clock, so just to be respectful of everybody's time, I wanted to go ahead and get started tonight. So first of all, I want to welcome everybody here this evening to get an update on this very important topic of the Potter Valley Project. My name is Devin Jones, and I'm the Executive Director of the Mendocino County Farm Bureau. So with that, I'm going to introduce our main speaker tonight. Familiar to a number of those in the room, I'm sure, is Janet Pauli. Janet is the chairperson of the Mendocino County Inland Water and Power Commission. So IWPC, as the acronym is the local entity in Mendocino County that is moving forward as part of the discussion over what's going to happen with the project in the future.
What I'd like to do this evening is give you a little bit of background on the project so everybody's up to speed, talk to you about the process that we've entered and where we are today and where I think we're going to be going. So first, just a brief introduction. Since 1922, we've had water. Summer water, year-round water in this region. That project has been diverting all year round since Scott Dam was built, forming Lake Pillsbury in 1922. Right now, we feel that that water supply is potentially threatened because of several events that have occurred with the entity that holds the license for the project, and I'll get into that a little bit more as we go along. What is the project? Most of you know it pretty well. It's a diversion, an interbasin diversion of water from the Eel River into the Russian River. It was originally built for power production. Its water supply has become critically important to our region. And there are impacts to species, endangered species and threatened species that have federal regulatory mandates with regards to them. So those issues combined make this project extremely complicated and controversial. The name is deceiving. It's called the Potter Valley Project. That makes people think that only Potter Valley is impacted by a loss or a decrease in this water supply. That's not true. Over 600,000 people in both Mendocino County and Sonoma County are dependent on this water supply in one way or another. So our goal is to maintain the quality of life for local communities while protecting our precious natural resources. In this process, we believe that it's unlikely that everyone will get exactly what they want. And we'll talk about what people want as we go on. But we're hopeful that moving into this process, everyone will end up having their needs met at the end. And the end might be a little ways away at this point in time. So to do this, to get trust and build a coalition, a regional coalition, it's going to take support of all the diverse groups that have these different concerns: wildlife and fish, agriculture, tribal concerns, households, communities, businesses, recreation, and government. Right now, what has occurred in this process, and I'll do a timeline in just a minute to get everybody to understand this a little bit more. There is a group, we call ourselves a Notice of Intent Partners, who have signed a planning agreement to basically license the Potter Valley Project. It sounds simple, it's not. We were required to file a notice of intent with the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission along these lines by July 1st. This group that's listed here in front of you, the Mendocino County Inland Water and Power Commission, Humboldt County of Humboldt, Sonoma Water, and CalTrout have signed an agreement. And a little later I'll talk to you about the main goals and objectives of that planning agreement that we signed. Really quickly, just because we'll be saying it a lot, the Mendocino County Inland Water and Power Commission that I chair is a joint powers authority. It was formed in 1996. The member agencies, all elected officials, sit on the commission. The Mendocino County Water Agency, Potter Valley Irrigation District, City of Ukiah, Redwood Valley County Water District, and the Russian River Flood Control and Water Conservation Improvement District. It's a great name. So where is it? Many of you probably know where Potter Valley is, and you know where Lake Mendocino is. And so you're familiar with that part of this system, these two linked river basins. What you may not know very much about is the Eel River. The Eel River is a massive watershed, over 3,600 square miles. It actually runs from south to north. This picture doesn't really show it all to you yet. The Potter Valley project is here, and this is the Eel River running from south to north. There are 4 other major tributaries or branches of the Eel River that are not on this slide. The Potter Valley project is located in the very top of the what's called the upper main stem Eel River. Where you see the name Potter Valley is where that diversion actually occurs. And what you can't tell, and what's really nice to have, is a relief map so you can actually look at the topography of this area. There's a hill, a small hill between the Russian River watershed and the Eel River watershed. Through that hill is a mile-long tunnel that was built. It was completed in 1908, and I'll talk about that in a minute in a little bit more detail, linking these two watersheds. This water project impacts water supply for several different counties. In fact, the Eel River watershed is not only in Humboldt County, Mendocino, and Lake County, but part of it is also in Trinity, Tehama, Glen, and Colusa. So a huge watershed. The Russian River side obviously impacts Mendocino County and Sonoma County and northern Marin County. So all of these counties have some say about what's going to happen with this project as we move forward. So before the early 1900s, basically these two rivers weren't linked. During the summertime, in both the Eel River, the upper Eel River, and in the Russian River, it wasn't uncommon for both of those rivers to go completely dry in the summertime. For agriculture, for example, that meant that everything was dry farmed. There was basically no summer irrigation except in very, very limited and small areas. So in the early 1900s, a man by the name of Van Arsdale came into the area. He wasn't looking for water supply for ag or anybody else except for hydropower production, because the city of Ukiah had a coal-burning plant and were dependent on it. And when Mr. Van Arsdale, who was an engineer, realized the difference in elevation between the Eel River and Potter Valley, for example, with a very small ridge of land in between the two, he realized that that 485-foot drop would be perfect for making hydropower. So he started a company, began the work in about 1905. In 1906, they stopped because they all went down to San Francisco to help out with the earthquake. They came back in 1907. They finished Cape Horn Dam, which forms Van Arsdale on the Eel River side, and dug a tunnel. The tunnel was completed in 1907. Water started coming through there, and the project was up and running and producing hydropower by 1908. They found out really quickly, however, that it worked really well when there was water in the Eel River, and it didn't work very well when there was no water in the Eel River. And there was basically no water in the Eel River from late spring through summer and into fall until the first rains occurred every year. So the next plan, and this was now a company called Snow Mountain Water and Power, was to build a dam upstream that could store snow melt and rainfall in the wintertime that could be released in the summertime and diverted through the project to produce power all year. They did that. In 1922, Scott Dam was built. Mr. Scott and Mr. Pillsbury were some of the investors out of San Francisco that put money into the project. That's how you get your name on a dam and a lake. And it's amazing that it suddenly there was water. in this watershed all summer long. People in Potter Valley obviously recognized it first. You know, their one crop of hay or maybe 1.5 cuttings of hay was all of a sudden they could irrigate. And so they formed an irrigation district. And in 1924, they became bonded. And by 1926, they'd built a series of gravity feed ditches and started to irrigate Potter Valley. It wasn't just Potter Valley, again. Remember that this water supply was going down the east branch of the Russian River and going through what is now Lake Mendocino and on down the Russian River. In 1930, PG&E purchased the license in the project from Snow Mountain Water and Power. And then a series of, everything was pretty quiet because that first license was granted by the Federal Power Company in those days from 1922 to 1972. So everything was going along, everything seemed fine. I'll mention a couple of points here because they will be important in the conversation in just a minute or two. There was a flood in 1937 in this area that no one had seen the likes of before. It caused incredible devastation to the point where the despair was so great that people actually went to the federal government and said, we need some help. The Army Corps of Engineers came in, looked at the project, the opportunities perhaps for flood control projects. While they were doing this and while they were in the process of building Coyote Valley Dam, there was another flood in 1955. Some people in the room might remember that flood. Apparently it flooded all of downtown Ukiah. The reason it's important is because prior to that, the people in this area really didn't care about Coyote Valley Dam or why we needed a dam or why we needed a lake, because it was actually all the flooding was the problem of those people down in Guerneville. But the 55 flood changed folks' minds, and they decided to fund part of the project. And in doing that, they actually were granted part of the water supply in Lake Mendocino. Sonoma County paid for the bulk of that project. So in 1959, Coyote Valley Dam was completed. That was phase 1 of the flood project. And then going on, I'll just skip ahead just for a second. 1983, the flood project phase 2 was completed when Warm Springs Dam was built, forming Lake Sonoma. So back now, 1972, the first 50-year license for the Potter Valley project expires. It took until 1983 for the project to be relicensed because it was controversial. There were concerns about flows in the Eel River. And so at the end, in 1983, the project was relicensed for the new 50-year license until April 2022. So from 1972 to 2022. During that relicensing process after 1983, PG&E was mandated to do 10 years worth of studies to look at the impact of the flows of the project on resources in the Eel River. At the end of that process, there was a series of discussions. There were several committees that were formed, fishery review group with all of the agencies, the various counties, and all of the stakeholders worked for many, many years, all through the 90s and into the early 2000s. During that time, things changed with regards to the Endangered Species Act and some of the regulatory concerns. The National Marine Fisheries Service ended up coming in towards the end of that process and started a process called a Section 7 consultation under the Endangered Species Act. So all of these studies that have been done, all the reports that have been done, all the analysis that were underway, at the end of all of that, in 2004, it was determined that flows in from the project needed to be changed, and actually the total flow of the diverted water through that project was cut by 50%. That's important because that's one of the reasons that Pacific Gas and Electric ended up doing what they've done in the last couple of years. So in 2017, let me go back just a second, the process for relicensing a hydropower plant, a FERC license, Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, takes 5 years to begin. 5 years before it expires, you have to start the process, and PG&E did. In 2017, they started the process. A whole series of events began. The timeline is very, very specific. And we were going down that path, just as we did with the last relicensing, until about a year ago when PG&E decided to sell the project. They decided to auction it. Mendocino County Inland Water and Power Commission stepped up to bid on it, understanding that we weren't going to be able to do that alone, and we were going to have to build a coalition to help us do that. We got almost right to the end of, we had prepared our proposal, and 2 days before we were going to submit it, PG&E decided that they would withdraw their notice of intent to relicense the project entirely. That was on January 25th. That next week, they filed bankruptcy. March 1st, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission announced that if anybody would like to license this project, please file a notice of intent to do so by July 1st. And then everything went upside down for a little while. And that's the time period within which we formed this coalition of 4 entities that exist today. We are working on broadening that coalition. We have a good deal of interest from the Round Valley tribes. There are some Russian River tribal entities that are also interested. Lake County Board of Supervisors has been having conversations. Northern Marin County also has been coming to a lot of meetings. There are a lot of meetings going on right now. Where we are right now with the Notice of Intent Partners is we're waiting for FERC. We're not really waiting for FERC because we went back to Washington, D.C., and I think FERC is going to accept our proposal to move forward this way. But in the meantime, we need to start looking at the formation of a final entity, because the 4 groups that we have now and any other groups that we bring together are going to have to coalesce into some kind of a legal form. And we're working on what that's going to look like. We're also looking at a feasibility study, which will tell FERC how we will be proceeding in the near future, looking at financing for the project. We have until April 2020 to finish the feasibility study. The license expires April 14th, 2022. Probably it's important to remember the goals here. There are 2 main goals. The one is to maintain the Potter Valley diversion at a rate and timing that will sustain our dependency. And there's a lot that covers. Dependency means a lot of things to a lot of different people. To some it's economic in terms of ag. Any of you who have businesses, any of you who have homes, our quality of life here, recreation, our ability to protect fisheries in both watersheds is dependent on how we manage this project moving forward. So besides water supply reliability, it has to do with habitat restoration. And this shared resource needs to be managed as a shared resource with everyone at the table. Why does it matter? I already touched on it. We have to be concerned about the environmental impacts of any changes that are made in the project in terms of water supply for habitat and water quality for us and for habitat. Farms, agriculture is the lifeblood of this region in terms of the economy and our community, our quality of life, the reason that we love to live here. In terms of the economy of agriculture, Dr. Robert Eiler did a study in 2015 where he was asked a simple question. Tell me what the agricultural economic impact is for Mendocino County based on water from Lake Mendocino alone used for irrigation. And these were the results of that study. More than $743 million of the county's $3.5 billion in revenue is generated here in the Russian River watershed from Redwood Valley south to our county line. More than 5,000 out of 32,000 jobs. This is in 2015, so these numbers may have changed a little bit. And approximately $16.1 million in local tax revenue based on water used for irrigation stored in Lake Mendocino that comes from the Potter Valley Project. These numbers, the $243 million number includes a multiplier. So this is not the value of just the raw commodity, but also products that are derived from it. For example, wine, canned pears, whatever else you can think of. It also includes income from tourism, wineries, tasting rooms, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's a couple of other areas that are not included in Eiler's study because they're not irrigated from water in Mendocino County from Lake Mendocino. One is Potter Valley. Potter Valley is upstream of Lake Mendocino. It produces between $30 and $35 million worth of crop. That's without a multiplier. And then Alexander Valley, very interestingly, everybody who's above the confluence with Dry Creek, this is from Healdsburg north, is dependent, in Sonoma County, is dependent on the water that's stored in Lake Mendocino, including Alexander Valley, which is one of the premier grape growing regions of the world. And I talked to their ag commissioner not long ago. He gave me an update for last year's crop value. This is just straight crop, no multiplier, $180 million last year in revenue from just the sale of grapes. Farms, of course, I mean, they're part of our rural landscape. They're one of the reasons that we, again, love to live here. The farm economy helps us be able to live in this place. So, wildlife and ecology. So much of what I mentioned, the studies that were done in the 80s and early 90s in the Potter Valley Project for the first relicensing, the studies didn't stop there. The mandate of those studies was to find a way to make the Potter Valley Project on the Eel River side, the releases on the Eel River, mimic the natural flows of that river, so that basically the impact of the project in terms of the diversion and everything below it was steady. In other words, as natural as it possibly could be. That's part of the reason that 50% of the water was no longer diverted through the project. As I said, it has continued to be studied. PG&E has in their budget millions of dollars worth of work that has to be done every year to manage that system. Is it perfect? No, it's not perfect. And in this new relicensing, part of the work that PG&E was doing that they stopped on January 25th was $11 million worth of studies to continue to look at how to manage that project so that it mimicked the natural hydrograph as perfectly as possible. During this whole process, Congressman Huffman 2 years ago started an ad hoc committee to look at this project, understanding that it was very controversial before. He felt that he could come in and help the process by facilitating a discussion. And in doing so, he formed two subcommittees. One is called Water Supply, and one is called Fish Passage. While I've been talking about the flows in the Eel River at the Van Arsdale and the diversion and below it, which have been matched and exceeded all through summer long from natural flows. The one concern that a lot of people have about the project is Scott Dam itself. Because when Scott Dam was built, it didn't have a fish ladder of any kind. There's no passage of Scott Dam that's available today. So the Fish Passage group has been looking at alternatives. How do we get fish above Scott Dam? And there are a whole series of potential ways to do that. Some that have been tried in other places and been successful, some that have never been tried and are being considered at this point in time. But they range from everything from a normal, what you would consider a ladder, to an elevator, to a tunnel, to cannons, to trap and haul, to partially taking down Scott Dam, to completely removing Scott Dam. And every single one of those potential projects has a good side and maybe a not so good side. So that's part of the concern that all of us are going to be dealing with moving forward in this entire process. We also need to remember that this is not going to be cheap. The studies, as I said, PG&E was going to do $11 million worth of studies just in 2 years to get to 2022 in the license process. To think that if they had done that, that would have been the end of the studies would be foolish, because obviously there would probably be other questions that were raised that are going to require more studies to be done. And all of that is going to cost money. There's also concerns for wildlife, particularly anadromous fish on the Russian River side, remembering that this man-made system is linked. And it has been linked now with summer water and water year-round for a long time, almost 100 years at this point in time since Scott Dam was built. So over the years, there have been regulations that have been promulgated on the Russian River as well. In fact, even in Potter Valley, California Department of Fish and Wildlife has a put-and-take rainbow trout fishery that requires certain flows to remain in the east branch of the Russian River. That's part of the license. Water that's stored in Lake Mendocino is used and is released at certain times of the year because of another Section 7 consultation that exists on the Russian River, showing that the dams have Swarm Springs Dam and Coyote Valley Dam have caused jeopardy, and so flows, an amount of water needs to be stored in Lake Mendocino for fall releases, but the actual rates of releases from Warm Springs and from Coyote Valley have to be maintained at certain levels year-round. There's a huge restoration project underway below Warm Springs Dam on Dry Creek now, costing millions and millions of dollars because the water released out of Warm Springs is too fast in the summertime and too high for oversummering steelhead juvenile fish, and so they've done a tremendous amount of work to try and mitigate that impact. And it's not just fish, it's other species of wildlife, everything from birds and mammals, reptiles, amphibians, and didn't put invertebrates on there, but they're really important and it should have been put on there. I'm going to add it. But anyway, and riparian habitats, et cetera. These are all important parts of our ecology that need to be maintained. And that's part of this entire process. In fact, a couple of the studies that PG&E had to do were with regards to bald eagles and to foothill yellow-legged frogs, et cetera. We tend to forget today how important power production is as well. That was the original purpose for this project. And currently, the Potter Valley project does still produce power, not as much as PG&E would have liked, or else they would still probably be relicensing this. The Potter Valley project itself generates 9.2 megawatts if it was at full production. It isn't often at full production anymore. There are 3 smaller powerhouses below it in Potter Valley. And there is water that's actually diverted at the base of Coyote Valley Dam for the city of Ukiah's powerhouse. Enough to provide power combined for about 11,000 homes. So while it's not a lot, it certainly is enough to make the project viable as a hydropower project. And we need to remember that to maintain this project as in any semblance of the way it is today requires it to be relicensed or licensed as a hydropower project. Drinking water for people, obviously we've talked about ag and we've talked about hydro, but drinking water for this area right here, Redwood Valley down to Hopland, about 31,000 people actually use this water as their main drinking water supply. I'll mention one more thing right there. That slide doesn't talk about the drinking water supply in Sonoma County, which I did mention earlier. From our county line to Healdsburg, all of the people in Cloverdale, Geyserville, and northern Healdsburg, about 80% of the people who live in Healdsburg are dependent on this water from Lake Mendocino as well. And then as you go downstream, it's less and less. But it's estimated that about 600,000 people use the water from Lake Mendocino in one way or another to some degree, whether it's part of Sonoma Water's infrastructure and the way they manage their water system and deliver it. It's a lot of people. Recreation, a lot of people forget recreation. There are a lot of tourist dollars that come into this area and certainly into Lake County. The winter rainfall and snow that's collected in Lake Pillsbury and then diverted and restored in Lake Mendocino gives us two really large, very popular lakes in our area. So everything that people enjoy about lakes and camping and hiking and boating is part of the consideration that needs to be in every conversation. Fire suppression. Every time a slide like this comes up, I get chills. After the last couple of years and what most of us have been through, I can't even imagine what might have happened in the last fires in 2017 and then last year if we hadn't had these water sources. I don't know if any of you, living in Potter Valley, we watched as it looked like the Army, the Navy, the Marines, and everybody else coming into Potter Valley and taking water out of our ponds in Lake Mendocino and Lake Pillsbury. It was an amazing operation. I'm sure the people in Lake County around the lake whose homes didn't burn, I'm assuming many of them were saved from water drops. I mentioned agricultural ponds. Every time there's a fire around here, you may notice that CAL FIRE shows up very quickly with helicopters and starts taking water out of our ponds. And irrigated fields actually can serve as a buffer. I know that in 2017, in my own family's situation, when the fire went through the first night, going from east to west, there was nothing anybody could do. But when it turned around and came back the next day, our irrigated vineyards protected many, many homes and farms and buildings in Potter Valley. So it may not seem important, but fire suppression is a value that we have, that we gain from these reservoirs. What would happen if the dams went away? Well, it's a rhetorical question, obviously. If suddenly Lake Mendocino went away, we would lose our control for both water supply and fire suppression and flood protection. Lake Pillsbury is basically a water supply facility. It doesn't provide much in the way of flood protection. But the stored water allows us to have some control over what happens here locally. And without dams, that control would be gone. This is something that people really don't like to talk about very much, and that is that the people who use the water are responsible for protecting it, I believe. I don't know, I think in the past, a lot of us have been sort of complacent. You turn on the tap, the water comes out, everything looks good. But now all of a sudden, I think there's a realization and understanding that the water supply could be in jeopardy. And the impact of this project is profound. I think that the more we understand the dependency and the base of dependency that's here, the more we'll be able to understand how we can manage this project and afford to fund it. And that includes monies for habitat restoration as well, because that's part of the whole process that we're moving into now. A few questions I can try to answer. How much is it going to cost? Well, we kind of have an idea about why PG&E no longer found it economical to run the project simply for hydropower production. One, they never tried to sell the water to anybody except Potter Valley Irrigation District, and we've been buying water from the Potter Valley project since 1926. We have a contract that we renewed with PG&E when they bought the project in 1930. And we pay, everybody laughs, we don't pay very much, but we pay for the water in Potter Valley. No one else downstream has ever paid for this water. And if you live in the city of Ukiah, you go, wait, I pay for my water. But does the city of Ukiah pay for the water? Or does the city of Hopland pay for the water? Et cetera, et cetera. So that's what I mean by the base of dependency that's going to end up having to step forward and fund part of this project moving forward. Again, the more people we have in that base, the more interests we have at the table who are concerned about the way the project is run, the more manageable it becomes for every one of us to fund this as we move forward. I wish I had a better answer about what it's going to cost. I can tell you it'll be millions of dollars per annum, and we're working on how we're going to finance that now. What are our elected representatives doing about it? Well, Jared Huffman has been very involved, as I mentioned, with his ad hoc. He's been a good facilitator of the discussion. A number of stakeholders were invited to be in that process now for the last couple of years. I think the base of that group could have been expanded at the beginning. I think his thought was not to get it too large at the very start. Now, with a new entity moving forward, there's a chance everyone needs to feel that they're represented in this process. And depending on all of those issues, and I'll bring them up again in a minute, any concern you have, at some point down the road, you should be able to feel that the new entity that forms is representing your interest. And I think that's one of our main goals. As one of the NOI partners, that is one of my main goals. Mike McGuire, Senator Mike McGuire, State Senator, and State Assembly Member Jim Wood are very engaged. They're up to speed. They're understanding. They sort of stepped back at this point in time only because the congressman has come up front so fast and is so strong. But they definitely are there and understanding. Our county boards of supervisors, Lake, Humboldt, Mendocino, Sonoma, are all engaged in having conversations at different levels. And these conversations really started in earnest about a year ago when PG&E decided to sell the project. That was the wake-up call. Other local elected officials, I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to city councils, irrigation districts, community groups in the last couple of years. More and more people are understanding what's at stake and are asking really good questions. And we're just hoping that we have some answers pretty quick to some of those questions. How are you working with groups with different priorities? Just exactly as I said, by bringing them to the table and having them be part of the conversation. That's the only way it can work. No one can be excluded. We have to start with an understanding of what the objectives are, and we should all come to the table understanding that all options are on the table. And when we start there, then we can move forward and see where it goes from there. Is it going to be simple? No, it's not going to be simple. Look at the list of concerns. Everything from wildlife to government. My goodness, that's a stretch right there. Ag, tribal, household, business, recreation, all of those interests have to believe that they're being represented. So, what can you do? You can keep talking to your friends, talking to people. The Farm Bureau has a list of things that they have suggested for you to do, and I think I'll have Devin come up and talk about this.
So a couple things on that two-pager, if you guys have a chance to pick it up. There is our website, and you don't have to memorize that specific link. We just mendofb.org. On the left side, there's a ladder. On the very bottom, there's Potter Valley project. Licensing, we posted most of the relevant documents that are on there. The notice of intent document is on there for reference. Different position statements from the counties, those types of things are on there. That's where we'll post this presentation as well. We'll link it on there tomorrow morning, so you guys can take a look at that and have a chance to read the small print. So we'll have that up there and have that available. So if you all have any questions, you know, email me as well. There's contact information at the back. If you want to sign up again for our listing, so if you want to keep up to date on, you know, future meetings, like Janet said, maybe 6 months or so, maybe sooner, depending on what's happening. We'll try to host another one of these meetings here locally to get everybody up to speed. Feel free to call us. If I don't have the answers, I can try to find the answers for you.